The rope was rough against her throat. Sakura Tanaka stood on the wooden chair in the corner of the barracks, her hands shaking as she tied the final knot. 23 years old, a clerk from Manila, a daughter of a Shinto teacher who had told her that death with honor was better than life with shame. It was 2:47 in the morning, September 15th, 1945. Fort McClellan, Alabama, the enemy's land, the place where she had been told American soldiers would parade her through streets like a trophy, where they would torture her, rape her, make an example of her suffering. But they had done none of those things. And somehow that was worse. The floorboards creaked as she shifted her weight. Through the window, she could see the guard tower silhouetted against the Alabama night sky. Crickets sang outside. Inside, 46 other Japanese women slept in their bunks, exhausted from the day's labor. Clean beds, clean sheets, full stomachs. That was the cruelty they could not name. That was the torture that broke her mind more completely than any violence could have. She kicked the chair away. The rope caught, tightened. The world began to blur at the edges, darkness creeping in like fog. This was right. This was how it should be. A loyal subject of the emperor does not accept kindness from the enemy, does not eat their food, does not sleep in their beds, does not. The door exploded inward, heavy boots on wood, shouting in English. Strong hands gripping her waist, lifting her up, releasing the pressure on her throat. The rope was cut. She felt herself being lowered to the floor, felt arms around her as she gasped and coughed and tried to understand why the enemy was saving her life. Sergeant James Morrison was 28 years old. He had kind eyes. She hated that about him. She hated that the first thing she saw when her vision cleared was genuine concern on his face, not the cruel pleasure she had been promised would be there. "Why did you save me?" she whispered in Japanese, not caring if he understood. "You're supposed to kill us." The translator arrived breathless. Betty Chen, a Chinese-American woman who worked in the administrative office. She repeated Sakura's words in English. Morrison's response came soft, almost apologetic. "Ma'am, nobody's dying on my watch, not even prisoners." Sakura stared at him, at the rope burns on her neck, at the chair lying on its side, at this American soldier who had just prevented her from doing the one thing that made sense in a world that no longer did. Her worldview. Everything she had been taught about American barbarity and Japanese superiority cracked like glass. She began to weep, not from pain, not from shame, but from the terrifying realization that she had been wrong about everything. And if she was wrong about this, what else had been a lie? If this story moves you, if you served during World War II or know someone who did, please leave a comment below. These memories are fading. We must preserve them while we still can. The summer heat of 1945 hung thick over the Pacific Islands like a wet blanket. News of Japan's surrender rippled through military installations on crackling radios and in hushed conversations between soldiers who could barely believe the war was finally ending. For American troops scattered across the Pacific theater, it meant going home. For the Japanese women left behind in occupied territories, it meant something else entirely, something unknown and terrifying. Sakura Tanaka had been a clerk at a supply depot in Manila. Before the war, she had been a student studying literature, dreaming of becoming a teacher like her father. Her father, Takeshi Tanaka, taught history and Shinto philosophy at a school in Tokyo. He had raised her on stories of Japanese exceptionalism, of the divine mission of the empire, of the barbaric nature of Western nations who understood nothing of honor or civilization. When she was recruited for military service at 19, he had presented her with a small Japanese flag folded carefully. "If you are captured," he had told her, his face stern but his hands gentle on her shoulders, "die with honor. Do not let them dishonor you. Do not let them dishonor our family. Promise me." She had promised. Standing in their small home in Tokyo, wearing her new uniform, she had bowed deeply and sworn that she would rather die than bring shame to the Tanaka name. That promise haunted her now. Reiko Hayashi was 26. She had been a nurse trained at one of Osaka's finest medical schools, graduating in the top 5% of her class. She had worked in field hospitals, moving from island to island as the war consumed the Pacific. She had performed amputations without anesthesia. She had held dying soldiers as they called for their mothers. She had watched gangrene consume limbs because there were no antibiotics, watched men die from infections that should have been treatable. Her hands bore the scars of that work. burns from sterilizing instruments over open flames when there was no proper equipment, cuts from broken glass used as surgical tools when metal ran out, the permanent calluses from gripping whatever tools she could find to save lives that usually could not be saved. She had learned to turn off her emotions, to see bodies as problems to solve rather than people to mourn. It was the only way to survive, the only way to keep working when everything around her was death and suffering and the slow collapse of an empire that had promised them victory. Michiko Watanabe was 42 years old. She had been a teacher in Kyoto for 15 years before the war, educating young women in history and traditional values. She was a widow. Her husband had died in China in 1939. Her son had died at Iwo Jima. She had received the notification 3 months ago, delivered by a stern-faced officer who bowed perfunctorily and left her standing in the doorway of the school where she taught, holding a piece of paper that said her boy was gone. After that, nothing seemed to matter very much. When she was mobilized for service, sent to work as a clerk in a military office in the Philippines, she went without protest. Death would come when it came. She was ready. Harumi Park was 19 years old. She was Korean. She did not speak much anymore. Could not really. The words had left her somewhere between her village in Busan and the comfort station where she had been sent at 16. 3 years. 3 years of a life that she tried very hard not to remember, tried very hard not to be present for, even as it was happening to her body. The other women did not speak to her much. They knew what she was, what she represented. The shame was too deep for words, so Harumi existed in silence, watching the world with dark eyes that seemed to see everything and feel nothing. And then there was Keiko Matsuda, 35 years old, former propaganda writer for the Imperial Army. She had crafted the words that told Japanese civilians about American atrocities. She had written speeches for officers about the divine superiority of the Yamato race. She had believed every word. When she was captured, when she found herself on a ship bound for America, she had stood at the railing and stared at the horizon, repeating to herself like a mantra, "They are demons. They are less than human. They will show their true nature." I was right. I was right. I was right. She had to be right. Because if she was wrong, if the words she had written were lies, then she had helped condemn her nation to a war built on falsehoods. That possibility was too terrible to contemplate. So she clung to her certainty like a drowning woman clings to driftwood, even as the water rose higher and higher around her. These 5 women, along with 42 others, were loaded onto trucks in the Philippine Islands in late August of 1945. They stood in silent groups, their clothing torn and stained, many barefoot, all terrified. American soldiers checked their names against lists, efficient and businesslike. No violence, no cruelty, just the machinery of military bureaucracy processing prisoners of war. The women kept their eyes down, shoulders hunched, waiting for the first blow that never came. The journey took 3 weeks. First by ship across the Pacific, the women crowded into holding areas deep in the hull, given 2 meals a day of rice and canned vegetables. More food than many of them had seen in months. Some refused to eat, at first convinced it was poison. But hunger eventually won, and they ate slowly, cautiously, waiting for symptoms that never manifested. At night, lying on thin mattresses in the darkness, they whispered to each other. "They will kill us at sea," one woman murmured. "Throw us overboard where no one can see." "No," another replied. "They will take us to America and put us in cages, display us like animals in zoos. I heard they do this." Reiko said nothing. She focused on breathing, on staying present, on not letting her mind spiral into the terrifying unknown that awaited them. Whatever came would come. Medical training had taught her to deal with what was in front of her, not what might be. When they finally saw the California coast through the morning fog, the women crowded at the portholes and railings, staring in disbelief. Buildings rose in neat rows, untouched by war. Streets were intact. Cars moved along roads. Everything was whole, functioning, alive. "It's as if the war never touched them," Sakura whispered to Reiko, standing beside her at the rail. Her voice carried something between awe and resentment. The contrast with their memories of Japan's bombed cities was overwhelming, incomprehensible. From San Francisco, they were loaded onto trains, clean trains with cushioned seats and windows that opened. The women sat rigidly, afraid to touch anything, convinced this comfort was somehow a trap. Through the windows, America rolled past. Mountains gave way to deserts, Then plains, then forests. They saw towns and cities, farms and factories all untouched by bombs. How can any country be this big? A woman whispered. This whole... The question hung in the air unanswered. The train finally stopped at a small station in Alabama. The heat hit them like a physical force when they stepped onto the platform. Different from Pacific heat, drier, heavier somehow. Buses waited to take them the final distance to Fort McClellan. The fort appeared through the bus windows as they approached. Guard towers stood at intervals along the fence. Barracks stretched in orderly rows. American soldiers moved about their duties with the casual efficiency of any military installation. It looked like every military base anywhere in the world. Functional, austere, but it was not what they had been told to expect. There were no cages, no crowds of jeering civilians, no public displays of humiliation. Just buildings and fences and soldiers doing their jobs. The buses stopped at an administrative building. The women were lined up outside, told to wait. An American officer emerged flanked by Betty Chen, who would serve as their translator for the duration of their imprisonment. You will be processed, Betty translated, her voice clear and professional. You will be given quarters, uniforms, and work assignments. You will work while you are here. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Do you understand? The women nodded, not understanding most of what was said, only catching fragments. Work. Treated. The specifics remained a mystery wrapped in fear. As they stood in the Alabama heat, waiting to learn what would happen next, Sakura felt something shift inside her. Not hope. She had learned not to hope, but a small crack in the wall of certainty, a tiny space where possibility might exist. They had expected to die. They had prepared themselves for the worst imaginable horrors. And yet here they stood alive, being spoken to with bureaucratic indifference rather than rage. What did it mean? The first stop was the medical building. The women were lined up outside a long, low structure painted white, its door propped open. Inside, they could see nurses moving in crisp white uniforms. The sight made Reiko's heart clench. She had been a nurse once, in another life. Before the war had turned healing into a desperate race against death that she almost always lost. One by one, they were called inside. When it was Sakura's turn, she walked into the examination room with her arms wrapped around herself, eyes fixed on the floor. The room was clean, almost sterile. Medical equipment lined the walls, instruments that gleamed under bright lights. An American doctor waited, an older man with gray hair and glasses. Two nurses stood beside him. Betty Chen was there to translate. The doctor gestured for Sakura to sit on the examination table. His movements were economical, professional. I need to check your vital signs, Betty translated. The doctor needs to make sure you are healthy. Sakura sat rigidly on the table, every muscle tense. When the doctor approached, she flinched. But his touch, when it came, was gentle, professional. He checked her pulse, listened to her breathing through a stethoscope, looked at her eyes and throat with a small light. Throughout the examination, he maintained a calm, detached demeanor. He was neither cruel nor especially kind. He was simply a doctor doing his job. When he finished, he made notes on a clipboard and said something to the nurse. Betty turned to Sakura. You are malnourished and dehydrated. You will be given supplements and a special diet to help you gain weight. Do you have any pain or injuries? Sakura shook her head, unable to speak. Her throat felt tight, not from the examination, from the sheer incomprehensibility of what had just happened. He had touched her, examined her body, and then simply let her go. No violence, no humiliation, just a medical examination. Outside, the other women waited anxiously. What did they do? Someone whispered urgently. They checked me, Sakura said slowly, her voice uncertain. Like a doctor, just like a doctor would. The women looked at each other, unable to process this information. It did not fit with anything they had been taught to expect. After the medical examinations, they were directed to another building. Inside, they found rows of shower stalls and benches. The air was warm and humid, filled with the smell of soap. A nurse, an American woman in her 40s, with a kind face, tried to explain through gestures what would happen. They would shower. They would be given soap and shampoo. Their old clothes would be taken and burned. They would be given new clothes. The women stood frozen. This was the moment they had been dreading. They would be forced to strip naked before their enemies, to stand vulnerable and exposed. This was where the humiliation would begin, where the violence would start. But the nurse simply pointed to the showers, gave them an encouraging nod, and left. She closed the door behind her, left them alone. The women stood in stunned silence. Slowly, hesitantly, they began to undress, helping each other with buttons and ties. When they were naked, they huddled together, arms wrapped around themselves, waiting, expecting men to burst through the doors at any moment, expecting cameras, expecting shame. Nothing happened. The silence stretched. The only sound was their breathing and the distant hum of pipes. Finally, Reiko stepped forward. She walked to one of the shower stalls and turned the knob. Water poured out, and after a moment it ran hot. Steam began to rise, filling the air with moisture and warmth. Reiko's eyes widened. Hot water, running hot water. She stepped under the stream and gasped. For the first time in over a year, she felt hot water on her skin, felt it washing away months of grime and fear and exhaustion. She picked up the bar of soap from the shelf. It was white, unmarked, and it smelled clean, fresh, like nothing she had smelled in so long. One by one, the other women joined her. They stood under the showers, feeling the hot water pour over them, washing away more than just dirt. Some began to cry, the water mixing with their tears. Others laughed strange, high-pitched sounds that echoed off the tile walls, sounds born from relief and confusion, and the breaking of something that had been held too tightly for too long. Sakura scrubbed her skin until it was red, trying to wash away more than the filth of travel. She worked the soap through her hair, watching the water at her feet turn gray, then gradually clearer. When she finally shut off the water and stood dripping on the tile floor, she felt lighter, as though something heavy had been washed away along with the dirt. Clean towels were stacked on shelves. The women dried themselves in silence, still waiting for the cruelty to begin. But there was only the sound of water dripping, the smell of soap, and the strange feeling of being clean. After showering, they were given simple cotton dresses to wear and directed to the mess hall. The building was large with long tables and benches. The smell of cooking food hit them as soon as they entered, and several women stopped in the doorway, overwhelmed. American soldiers were eating at some of the tables. They glanced at the Japanese women with curiosity, but made no aggressive moves. The women were directed to a separate section of the hall where trays had been set out. On each tray was more food than most of them had seen in months. White rice perfectly cooked, steamed vegetables still with texture and color, a piece of fried chicken golden and crispy still steaming, a roll with a pat of butter melting on top, a cup of what looked like pudding, and a tall glass of cold milk condensation forming on the outside of the glass. The women stood staring at the trays, unable to move. This had to be a trick, a test of some kind, or perhaps it was meant for someone else. Surely this abundance could not be for prisoners. "Sit, eat," an American soldier said, gesturing to the tables. His tone was not unkind, just matter of fact. Slowly the women sat down. They picked up their forks with trembling hands. Sakura looked at Reiko across from her. Reiko nodded slightly, and they both took small bites. The rice was perfect, soft and white. The vegetables were cooked but still had texture, seasoned with butter and salt. The chicken was tender, crispy on the outside, seasoned with herbs they could not identify. It was real food prepared with care, served hot. Some of the women began to cry as they ate. Others ate mechanically, their faces blank, unable to process what was happening. A few could not eat at all, their throats closing with emotion. Reiko ate slowly, methodically, her medical training taking over. Her body needed this food. She would eat even if her mind could not process what it meant. But as she swallowed each bite, questions swirled in her head. Why were they being fed like this? What did the Americans want? In Japan, she had treated wounded soldiers who were given nothing but rice gruel when there was anything at all. Civilians had starved in the streets. Children had died of malnutrition. And here the enemy was feeding prisoners chicken and pudding. It made no sense. None of it made any sense. After the meal, they were taken to their barracks. The building was simple but clean, with rows of beds lined up along the walls. Each bed had a mattress, sheets of pillow, and a thin blanket. At the foot of each bed was a small footlocker for personal belongings. An American officer speaking through Betty explained the rules. They would rise at 6 in the morning, breakfast at 7, work assignments during the day, lunch at noon, dinner at 6 in the evening, lights out at 10. They were not to leave their designated areas without permission. They were to obey all orders from American personnel. The women listened in silence, trying to absorb this information. It sounded like military routine. Structured and orderly, it did not sound like punishment. When the officer left, the women explored their new quarters cautiously. Sakura sat on her assigned bed and tested the mattress. It was thin, but clean softer than anything she had slept on in over a year. She touched the sheets. White cotton, slightly rough, but whole. No tears, no patches. That night, lying in the dark barracks, listening to the sounds of other women breathing, crying softly, or whispering prayers, Sakura pulled out a small notebook she had managed to keep hidden throughout her captivity. She had stolen it from an abandoned office in Manila, had kept it tucked in her clothing through the entire journey. By the light from the window, she wrote in careful characters, "They gave us food, hot water, clean beds. I do not understand. We were told they would torture us, rape us, kill us. Instead, they treat us like—" I cannot finish this sentence. I do not know what to call this. It is not kindness. They are not our friends. But it is not cruelty either. What is happening here? She put the notebook away and lay down, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Outside, crickets sang in the Alabama night. Inside, the sound of quiet weeping gradually faded into exhausted silence. They had survived the first day, but survival was becoming more confusing than death might have been. The days at Fort McClellan began to follow a pattern. The wake-up bell rang at 6 in the morning, sharp and insistent. The women rose from their beds, made them according to the military standards they had learned in their previous lives, and filed to the washrooms. Running water, toilets that flushed, mirrors on the walls that reflected faces slowly filling out color, returning to cheeks that had been hollow and gray. Breakfast was served promptly at 7. Oatmeal with brown sugar. Toast with butter and jam. Sometimes eggs scrambled and fluffy, always fruit, always milk, always coffee. Real coffee, not the barley substitute they had grown accustomed to during the war. The women ate in silence at first, still unable to reconcile the abundance with their expectations of captivity. After breakfast came work assignments. Sakura was sent to the administrative offices where she would file papers and sort mail under the supervision of Sergeant James Morrison's unit. The work was quiet, repetitive, and gave her far too much time to think. She worked alongside American clerks who mostly ignored her, speaking to each other in English she could not fully understand. Morrison himself was professional, cordial, but maintained a careful distance that somehow felt more charged than if he had been overtly friendly. On the third morning, she found a Hershey's chocolate bar on her desk. No note, no explanation. She looked up to see Morrison walking away, his back to her hands in his pockets. He did not turn around. She stared at the chocolate bar for a full minute before tucking it into her pocket, her heart beating faster than it should. Reiko was assigned to the hospital, working under the direction of Dr. William Carter. He was 54 years old, stern-faced with iron gray hair, cut military short, and eyes that seemed to see through pretense and straight into truth. On her first day, he handed her a roll of bandages and pointed to a soldier with a laceration on his forearm. "Bandage that, properly," he said, watching her with the intensity of a professor administering an exam. Reiko's hands remembered what her mind had tried to forget. Muscle memory from years of training, from hundreds of wounds dressed under impossible conditions. She cleaned the wound, applied antiseptic, wrapped the bandage with the precise tension that would keep it secure without cutting off circulation. When she finished, she stepped back, waiting for judgment. Dr. Carter nodded once. "You'll do. Follow me." It was not praise, but it was acceptance. And in that moment, Reiko felt something she had not felt in years. Purpose, the sense that her skills still mattered, that she could still be useful, that she was still a nurse, and not just a prisoner wearing nurse's clothing. Michiko was assigned to the laundry with several younger women. The work was hard, physical, but there was something meditative about the rhythm of washing and folding, the smell of clean linen, the simple repetitive motions that allowed her mind to wander without dwelling too deeply on loss. She worked mostly in silence, but she noticed Harumi, the young Korean woman working nearby. Also silent, also lost in whatever thoughts she kept locked behind those dark, watchful eyes. Sometimes their eyes would meet and something passed between them. Not friendship exactly, but recognition. Two women carrying unbearable weight, finding a moment of shared burden in the steam and soap of a military laundry. Michiko had started coughing in the second week. Just a tickle, at first easily dismissed. But it persisted, growing deeper, more frequent. She ignored it. She had survived her husband's death and her son's death. A cough was nothing. Keiko was assigned to kitchen duty. The irony was not lost on her. She who had written propaganda about American barbarism was now chopping vegetables under the supervision of Chef Raymond Williams, a 52-year-old black man from Louisiana who ran his kitchen with the precision of a military operation and the warmth of a grandfather. "You don't gotta like me, honey," he told her through Betty's translation on the first day. "Just chop them carrots straight." Keiko worked in hostile silence, her movements sharp and angry, each cut of the knife an act of defiance. Raymond watched her with patient amusement, saying nothing, letting her rage exhaust itself against the cutting board. 2 weeks into their captivity, mail call was announced. The women gathered in the common area of the barracks, hearts pounding with a mixture of hope and dread. A military postal worker read names from a clipboard. Some women received letters, others did not. Those who did not receive letters tried to hide their disappointment, their fear that their families were gone, that there was no one left to write to them. Tanaka Sakura. Sakura stepped forward, hands trembling, and accepted an envelope. She recognized her mother's handwriting immediately, precise characters brushed with the careful elegance her mother had always prided herself on. The envelope was worn, had traveled a long distance, had been opened and resealed by military censors. She took it back to her bunk and stared at it for a long time. If she opened it, Japan would become real again. If she opened it, she would have to confront what she had become, a woman eating enemy food, wearing enemy clothes, sleeping in enemy beds. A woman who found herself thinking about an enemy soldier's kind eyes more often than was appropriate or safe. She tucked the letter into her notebook unopened. It would stay there, a weight against her heart, for 37 more days. By the third week, the routine had become almost normal. Almost. The women had learned the layout of the fort, the schedules, the expectations. They had learned which guards were friendly and which were merely professional. They had learned that the abundance of food was not a trick, that the hot water would not run out, that no one was coming to drag them away for torture in the middle of the night. And that normality was its own form of torture, because each day of decent treatment, each moment of basic human dignity, chipped away at the certainty they had carried with them from Japan. The certainty that had been their armor, their identity, their reason for enduring. If the Americans were not the demons they had been taught to expect, then what did that say about everything else they had been taught? What did it say about the war, about the empire, about themselves? One evening, Sakura was leaving the administrative building when she found Morrison sitting on the steps outside smoking a cigarette. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then he gestured to the space beside him. Not too close, respectful of boundaries. She sat, maintaining a careful distance between them. Betty Chen emerged from the building a moment later, as if she had been waiting for precisely this moment. The translator stood nearby her presence, making the conversation possible while also serving as a chaperone. "I have a sister your age," Morrison said, his voice quiet in the evening air. "In California. She writes letters I can't answer because I'm here." Betty translated. Sakura listened, trying to understand why he was telling her this. "Why you tell me this?" she asked carefully. "Because you look like you miss home," Morrison said. "I miss home too. War's stupid that way. Makes everybody miss home, but nobody can go there." It was the first time anyone had acknowledged her humanity beyond the simple mechanics of prisoner and guard. The first time someone had suggested that they might have something in common beyond the accident of being on opposite sides of a war. Sakura felt something crack open in her chest, something dangerous, something that felt suspiciously like hope. From a window above, Keiko watched the exchange, her face tight with disapproval in something that might have been fear. Week 3 brought a new discovery. The women were informed that they had access to a canteen, a small store on the base where they could purchase items with script tokens earned from their work. The first time they entered the canteen, they stopped in the doorway, stunned into silence. Shelves held chocolate bars, cigarettes, writing paper, pencils, toothpaste, soap, magazines, small bottles of perfume, needles, and thread hair ribbons. It was abundance beyond comprehension, luxury beyond imagining. Sakura stood before a shelf of chocolate bars, her hand hovering, but not touching. In Japan, chocolate had become a distant memory, a luxury from before the war. Here were rows of it available for purchase with tokens earned by sorting American mail. She bought one bar. That night, sitting on her bed, she unwrapped it slowly, savoring each square. The sweetness exploded on her tongue, rich and overwhelming. Tears ran down her face as she ate. She did not know if she was crying from joy or shame or some emotion she had no name for. Around her, other women made similar discoveries. Real soap that smelled like flowers, writing paper to send letters home. Small luxuries that made them feel almost human again. But every purchase came with guilt. Every moment of pleasure was shadowed by the knowledge of suffering back home. We are prisoners who live better than we ever did when we were free, Reiko said one night, her voice hollow in the darkness of the barracks. What does that make us? No one answered. The question was too big, too painful, and the answer seemed to change with every passing day. On day 20, the tension that had been building finally erupted. Keiko confronted a group of women who had bought items from the canteen. Her voice was sharp, cutting through the evening quiet of the barracks. You've forgotten who you are. You've forgotten our people starving while you eat chocolate and buy perfume like American women. Sakura stood up from her bunk, her jaw set. Our people told us Americans were monsters. Were they lying about that too? The silence that followed was electric, dangerous. Every woman in the barracks held her breath. Keiko's hand moved before anyone could react. The slap cracked across Sakura's cheek, sharp and shocking. Sakura's head snapped to the side, her hand flying to her face. Morrison, making his evening rounds, appeared in the doorway. He assessed the situation in an instant, stepped between them firmly but without violence. His hands did not touch either woman. His voice when he spoke was calm but carried absolute authority. That's enough. Both of you, step back. Keiko screamed at him in Japanese, her voice ragged with emotion. She's become your whore. She's forgotten her people, forgotten her honor. Betty, translating, softened the language but kept the meaning. Morrison's face remained neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. Not anger, something sadder, something like disappointment. Ma'am, I don't know what you just said, but I can guess, he said quietly. Nobody here is anybody's whore. She's a clerk. She does her job. That's all. And if you raise your hand to another prisoner again, there will be consequences. Do you understand? The restraint in his voice was what shocked them. In the Japanese military, Keiko would have been beaten for insubordination, for striking another worker, for showing such disrespect to authority. Here she was simply separated and given a warning. The contrast was stark, impossible to ignore. Keiko stumbled back to her bunk, shaking her worldview, fracturing faster than she could repair it. Day 27 began like any other day, until it did not. Michiko collapsed in the laundry room at 9:30 in the morning. One moment she was folding sheets, the next she was on the concrete floor, the basket of linens scattered around her. The sound of her body hitting the ground echoed through the building like a gunshot. Harumi screamed. It was the first sound anyone had heard her make, high and sharp and full of terror. Women rushed over. Michiko's skin was gray, burning with fever. Her breathing was labored, shallow, each inhalation a visible struggle. Reiko, summoned from the hospital, took one look and knew. Pneumonia, advanced, possibly days from being fatal. The stretcher arrived within 3 minutes. 2 medics, one of them, Morrison, lifted Michiko carefully onto the canvas. Sakura watched Morrison's face as he worked. He was not performing concern. This was genuine. His movements were gentle, efficient, his expression focused in the way of someone who has seen too much death and is determined to prevent more. They carried Michiko to the hospital at a near run. Dr. Carter was in surgery when she arrived. A nurse directed the medics to place Michiko on a gurney in the hallway. When Carter emerged an hour later, still in his surgical gown, he stopped at Michiko's side. He checked her pulse, listened to her breathing. His face remained impassive, but Reiko, assisting him, saw the calculation happening behind his eyes. Pneumonia, he confirmed. Severe. She needs a bed, oxygen, penicillin. Where's her chart? The nurse hesitated. Sir, we don't have any beds available. The flu has filled the ward. We have Germans, Americans, even a couple of civilians. We're at capacity. Carter looked at the ward through the doorway. 30 beds, all occupied. He looked back at Michiko, struggling to breathe on the gurney. Put her on the floor, he said finally. Corner of the ward. Best we can do for now. Get me a mattress and a blanket. Reiko helped move Michiko to the corner of the ward, placed a thin mattress on the cold floor, covered her with a single blanket. Michiko's eyes were closed, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. This was how it would end, Reiko thought. On an enemy floor like an animal. All the propaganda validated. All Keiko's certainty proven correct. Word spread quickly through the camp. The Japanese women came to visit when they could, kneeling on the floor beside Michiko, holding her hand, speaking soft words of comfort she probably could not hear. Sakura came after her shift, sat beside her friend, and wept quietly. Keiko came too. She stood at a distance, watching. Her face was a mask of vindication and sorrow mixed together in equal measure. This was what she had been warning them about. This was the truth beneath the false kindness. A dying woman left on the floor because she was not worth a bed. That evening, Keiko gathered 12 women in the barracks. "We stop working," she announced, "until they give Michiko proper treatment, until they show us the respect we deserve. We refuse." The women looked at each other uncertainly. Sakura stood up, positioned herself between Keiko and the others. "Keiko, please, think about what you're doing." "I am thinking," Keiko shot back. "I'm thinking that we've become too comfortable, too accepting. We've forgotten that we are prisoners of war, not guests at a resort." Morrison was called in to handle the situation. He entered the barracks to find the women divided, tension crackling in the air. Keiko and her group stood with arms crossed, defiant. Sakura stood alone between them and the door. Morrison looked at Sakura. Their eyes met. Something passed between them. Trust, understanding, the beginning of something neither of them could afford. "Let me talk to her first," Sakura said softly. "Please." Morrison stepped back, gave her space. It was a small gesture, but in that moment it meant everything. Sakura turned to Keiko. "I thought like you once. I tried to die because I couldn't bear the confusion. He stopped me." She touched the faint bruise still visible on her neck. "Not because I'm useful to them. Not because I'm his enemy to torment. Because he thought my life had value. Their system makes us equal to them," Keiko said, her voice shaking. "That's the ultimate insult. That's how they destroy us. Not with cruelty, but with this false equality." The truth of her fear laid bare. Keiko could not accept equality because it destroyed her identity. If she was equal to her enemy, then what had the war been for? What had all the suffering meant? Day 30 began at 6 in the morning. Dr. Carter entered the ward for his rounds, coffee in hand, his movements efficient despite the early hour. He made his way through the beds, checking charts, speaking briefly with patients, adjusting medications. When he reached the corner where Michiko lay on the floor, he stopped. He knelt down beside her, checked her pulse. It was weak, thready, barely there. Her fever had spiked to 105 degrees. Her breathing was so shallow that her chest barely moved. The pneumonia was winning. Carter looked at the empty space where a bed should be. Looked at the other beds in the ward, all occupied. Looked back at Michiko, this 42-year-old Japanese woman who had survived a war and was now dying on his floor because there was no room for her. Something in his face shifted. A decision made. He stood up and turned to Reiko, who was standing nearby, exhausted from the night shift. "Get me a bed. Clear Private Henderson. Minor contusion, he can sit in a chair. Move him now." Reiko froze. "But sir, she's my patient," Carter said, his voice cutting through her hesitation like a scalpel through tissue. "Move." The ward erupted into quiet, efficient activity. Nurses moved Private Henderson to a chair, stripped the bed, made it fresh with clean sheets. Carter did not wait. He knelt down beside Michiko again and slid his arms under her frail body. She weighed 87 pounds. A woman who had once been solid and strong, reduced by war and starvation to skin and bones. Carter lifted her as though she were made of glass, as though she were precious, as though her life mattered more than any other consideration in that moment. Michiko's eyes fluttered open. She saw the face of an American doctor inches from her own. She saw not disgust, not contempt, not the cruelty she had been taught to expect. She saw concentration, care, determination. He carried her across the ward, 30 feet that felt like an eternity. Every eye in the room watched. German prisoners of war, American soldiers, Japanese women who had come to visit, all of them frozen, witnessing something that defied easy categorization. The only sounds were his footsteps and Michiko's labored breathing. He reached the freshly made bed and laid her down with infinite gentleness. He adjusted the pillow under her head, himself did not delegate the task to a nurse. He pulled the blanket up to her chin. He brushed a strand of gray hair back from her forehead, a gesture that was almost paternal, certainly tender. Then he turned to the nurse. Penicillin, IV fluids, oxygen, full treatment protocol. Start it now. The nurse hesitated for just a fraction of a second. Sir, she's a prisoner. Dr. Carter's voice when he responded was not loud, but it carried the weight of absolute conviction. In this hospital, there are no prisoners, only patients. Is that clear? Yes, sir. Sakura was standing in the doorway. She had come to visit before her shift. She saw the whole thing, saw this American doctor, this representative of the enemy, lift their dying friend and carry her like she was his own mother. Like her life had value, like she mattered. Her hands flew to her mouth. Tears streamed down her face. She collapsed against the door frame, sobbing uncontrollably. Reiko stood beside the bed assisting as Carter established the IV line as he adjusted the oxygen flow, as he made Machiko comfortable with the kind of care that transcended nationality and politics and war. Reiko's professional mask, maintained through years of trauma and loss, finally cracked. She realized in that moment what medicine was supposed to be. Not triage by nationality, not allocation of resources based on worth or utility. Just healing, just the fundamental recognition that every life has value, that every person deserves care when they are suffering. Thank you, she whispered to Carter in broken English. I not know how to. Carter looked at her, his expression softening slightly. You don't need to thank me, you need to help me save her. Can you do that? Reiko nodded, tears falling as she prepped the medication. Yes, she could do that. She remembered how to do that. In the hallway, Keiko stood frozen. She had come to the hospital to check on Machiko, to validate her certainty that the Americans would let her die. Instead, she had witnessed something that shattered every belief she had clung to for survival. Her jaw clenched, her hands shook. The cognitive dissonance was visible on her face, a war between what she had seen and what she needed to believe. She turned and ran from the hospital. She would not speak for 3 days. That afternoon, the whispered conversations in the barracks reached a fever pitch. The women could not stop talking about what had happened, could not stop processing the impossible thing they had witnessed. He touched her. He put his hands on her. An enemy woman worthless to him, and he carried her like she was precious. Did you see his face? There was no disgust, no hesitation. In Japan, we let wounded soldiers die in hallways when there were not enough resources. We assigned value to lives based on their utility. And this man, well, the sentence hung unfinished because none of them had words for what they had seen. If you served as a medic or doctor during World War II, how did you treat enemy prisoners? Did you face similar moral choices? Your stories matter. Please share them in the comments below. That evening, Chef Raymond heard about what Dr. Carter had done. He prepared a special broth rich with chicken and vegetables and sent it to the hospital with instructions that it was for the Japanese patient in bed 12. That night, he added extra portions to all the Japanese women's dinner trays. Extra chicken, extra vegetables, more than they could eat. Keiko stared at her tray. The extra food felt like an accusation. In the guard shack, Morrison's unit was having a conversation that echoed similar discussions happening across the base. A young private from Alabama, barely 21, spoke up. I don't get it, Sarge. My brother died at Okinawa. Why are we treating Japs like they're white folks? Morrison was quiet for a long moment. War's over. Doc Carter's right. In that hospital, they're just sick people. That make you uncomfortable? Another soldier asked. Seeing the enemy get the same treatment as us? Morrison looked out the window toward the administrative building where Sakura worked. Yeah, he admitted. Makes me real uncomfortable. But maybe that's the point. Late that night, Sakura found Morrison outside the barracks during his rounds. For the first time since her arrival, she was the one who initiated contact. She walked up to him deliberately, her expression a mixture of confusion and something that might have been admiration. Through Betty, who seemed to materialize whenever they needed her, Sakura asked the question that had been burning in her mind all day. Why did your doctor do that? Morrison thought about his answer carefully. Because that's who we are. Or who we're supposed to be. But we were told. I know what you were told, Morrison interrupted gently. I know what we were told too, about you, about the Japanese. Most of it was lies, on both sides. There was a moment of silence. Then Sakura spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. In my country, wounded soldiers left to die if not useful. I saw this. I helped. I am not. I am not good person. War makes everybody do things, Morrison said. Question is what you do after. I don't know who I am now. Morrison reached out, touched her shoulder briefly, then pulled back as if the contact had burned him. Then figure it out. You got time. You're safe here. The touch lingered on her skin long after he walked away. She knew they were crossing lines that should not be crossed. She knew this connection was dangerous, inappropriate, impossible. She did not care. That night, alone in her bunk, while the other women slept, Sakura finally opened the letter from her mother. Her hands shook as she unfolded the thin paper as she read the precise characters by moonlight. The letter was devastating in its simplicity. Her family had been told she was dead. They had held a funeral ceremony for her. Her father had cried for the first time her mother had ever witnessed. Tokyo was destroyed. Their house was gone. They lived in a shelter made from sheet metal. Her father was sick. They ate once a day if they were lucky. The old neighbor had starved to death. Her mother did not know if this letter would reach her, did not know if Sakura was alive or dead in American hands or Russian. She prayed her daughter had died quickly without suffering. The letter ended with a simple declaration of eternal love. Sakura dropped the letter. Her breathing came in short gasps, faster and faster, until she was hyperventilating. Other women woke, rushed over. Reiko knelt beside her, placed a hand on her back. They thought I was dead, Sakura managed to say between gasps. They starved while I ate chicken. They suffered while I... She could not finish. The guilt crashed over her like a tsunami, drowning her in its weight. Every meal, every shower, every chocolate bar, every moment of feeling almost human. All of it became accusation. All of it became betrayal. The women gathered around her. Many had received similar letters. One woman's entire family had died in the Tokyo firebombing. Another's husband had been executed as a war criminal. They held each other in the darkness, sharing grief that had no adequate expression, mourning losses that could never be recovered. In her bunk on the other side of the barracks, Keiko was notably absent from this communal mourning, women noticed. Whispered, "Where was Matsuda? Why was she not here?" The answer came at 3 in the morning when a guard on night patrol noticed a light in the laundry building. He went to investigate and found Keiko hanging from a ceiling pipe, unconscious. Her face blue, the rope tight around her neck. He shouted for help, cut her down, began CPR. His hands trained for exactly this emergency pressed rhythmically on her chest, forcing air into lungs that did not want to breathe. The irony was not lost on anyone. An American guard performing CPR to save a Japanese woman who hated Americans. Dr. Carter was called from his quarters at 3:15 in the morning. He ran to the laundry building in pajamas and boots, his medical bag in hand. He found Keiko on the floor, the guard still doing compressions. Carter took over his hands, moving with practiced efficiency. How long unconscious? 2 minutes. Maybe 3. Carter established a pulse. Weak, but present. Get her to the hospital. Now. Someone get Reiko. I need my best nurse. Reiko was woken at 3:20, told that Keiko had tried to kill herself. Her first reaction before she could stop it was simple and terrible. She finally did what she said she would. Her second reaction was more complex. If the Americans saved Keiko, if they brought her back from the edge of death, then Keiko would have to face that she had been wrong. About everything. And that might be crueler than letting her die. But Dr. Carter did not give her a choice. You're my best nurse. She's dying. Help me save her or get out. They worked for 3 hours. Oxygen, airway management, treatment for the rope, burns around her neck, the damaged trachea. Carter worked without hesitation, with complete focus, with the same intensity he would bring to any patient whose life hung in the balance. At 6 in the morning, as the sun rose over Fort McClellan, Keiko was stabilized, breathing on her own, alive. Carter removed his gloves, sat down heavily in a chair, exhaustion written in every line of his face. She'll live. Might lose her voice for a while. Throat's damaged. Reiko stood across from him, her own hands still shaking from the adrenaline. Why did you save her? She hates you. She hates all of us who work with you. Carter looked at her with something that might have been pity. Because that's my job. I don't save people who like me. I save people who need saving. There's a difference. Reiko felt something fundamental shift inside her. In Japan, we let people die with honor. You don't let anyone die at all. Honor doesn't keep you breathing, Carter said. Medicine does. At 8 in the morning, Keiko woke up. Her first sight was the American hospital ceiling, the American flag on the wall, the face of Dr. William Carter looking down at her with professional concern. Her second sight was Reiko holding her hand, the ultimate defeat, saved by the enemy she had sworn to hate. Her voice when she tried to speak was a hoarse whisper. Why, boy? Why what? Carter asked. Why save me? I am nothing to you. You're a human being who tried to kill herself, Carter said. That makes you my responsibility. I don't want this. I want to die. Carter's voice when he responded was stern, almost harsh. Too bad. You're alive. Now you got to figure out what to do about it. He left her with that thought. That afternoon, Sakura came to visit. She sat beside Keiko's bed in silence for a long time. Finally, she spoke. I opened my letter. My family thinks I'm dead. Keiko's voice was raspy, damaged. Maybe they're right. Maybe we did die. Maybe these are different people. I think, Sakura said slowly, I think we died the moment that doctor picked up Michiko. What kills me, Keiko whispered, is that I can't hate him. I want to. I should. But I can't. They sat together and shared understanding. Two women whose worldviews had been destroyed, who could not go back to who they had been, who did not yet know who they would become. On day 32, all 47 women gathered in the common room of their barracks. Michiko was recovering out of immediate danger. Keiko was stable, would live, would speak again, eventually. But something had fundamentally changed in all of them. Sakura stood before the group and read her mother's letter aloud. Her voice shook but did not break. When she finished, the women sat in heavy silence. We can't go back to who we were, someone finally said. But who are we now? The question hung in the air unanswered. Then Morrison appeared in the doorway. He looked uncomfortable, as though he knew his presence would not be welcome. But he had information they needed. Ladies, we have news from Japan. The repatriation process is beginning. You'll be going home in 4 to 6 weeks. It should have been joyful news. It should have been the answer to every prayer they had whispered in the darkness. Instead, terror rippled through the group. The women looked at each other with the same question in their eyes. How do we return to a destroyed country after living like this? How do we explain what happened here? How do we carry this truth back to a nation that will not want to hear it? Sakura caught Morrison's eye across the room. Something passed between them. Sorrow, longing, the acknowledgement of an impossibility. They both knew their time was running out. The final weeks at Fort McClellan carried a strange quality, like the last days of summer before autumn arrives. Everything was the same, yet fundamentally different. The women rose at 6, 8 at 7, worked their assignments, returned to barracks at night. But now every routine carried the weight of impermanence. Every meal was one meal closer to the last. Every conversation might be the final one. Keiko's recovery was slow but steady. Her voice returned gradually, though it remained raspy, a permanent reminder of the rope and the choice she had made, and the Americans who had refused to let her escape through death. She moved through the hospital with a new quietness, watching Dr. Carter work with an expression that might have been wonder, or might have been grief, or might have been both at once. One afternoon, as Carter changed the bandages on her neck, he spoke without looking at her directly. You're healing well. Vocal cords might never be 100% though. Good, Keiko replied, her damaged voice making the words sound like gravel shifting. I said too many wrong things with them anyway. Carter paused, surprised. He looked at her face, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. That's unexpectedly self-aware. You saved me twice, Keiko said. Once from the rope, once from myself. Carter said nothing. He finished the bandaging in silence, but something in the set of his shoulders had softened. On day 45, Keiko walked to the administrative office where Sakura worked. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, gathering courage. Then she entered and approached Sakura's desk. The other clerks watched with curiosity as Keiko executed a full 90-degree bow, the kind reserved for the most formal apologies, the kind that acknowledges deep wrongdoing. I was wrong, Keiko said, her voice rough but clear. About everything. Forgive me. Sakura stood quickly, helped Keiko straighten. We were all wrong. We just found out at different times. For the first time since her arrival at Fort McClellan, Keiko smiled. It was small, tentative, like a muscle that had forgotten how to work. Being wrong together is better than being right alone. The relationship between Morrison and Sakura had not gone unnoticed. It could not really. The way they looked at each other when they thought no one was watching. The careful way they maintained distance, as if proximity might ignite something neither could control. The charged silence that fell when they were in the same room. Betty Chen pulled Sakura aside one afternoon in week 8. They were alone in the file room, surrounded by manila folders and the smell of paper and ink. "You know this can't go anywhere, right?" Betty said. Not unkindly, just stating a fact that needed to be stated. "I know," Sakura replied. "Do you, because you're looking at him like he's water and you're dying of thirst?" "Does knowing change feeling?" Sakura asked quietly. Betty had no answer for that. On day 50, Morrison found Sakura after her shift. They stood behind the administrative building in the space between propriety and possibility, between what should be and what could never be. "I talked to my CO," Morrison said, his voice low. "Asked if, when you go back, if maybe I could write to you." "What would you say in letters?" Sakura asked. "That I'm sorry for what my country did to yours, and that—" He paused, struggling. "That I wish things were different. I wish this too, but different how I am still Japanese. You are still American. This," she gestured between them at the invisible thing that connected them, "is not possible. Maybe not now, but someday." After things settle, Sakura pulled a small piece of paper from her pocket. She had written her mother's address in Tokyo in careful English letters. She pressed it into his hand. "If you write, I will answer. But James, do not hope too much. Hope is dangerous thing now." Their hands touched as he took the paper. They held the contact for 3 heartbeats longer than necessary. It was the most physical contact they had ever had, the most they would ever have. Neither of them knew that Sakura's father would burn Morrison's letters, all 3 of them, before Sakura ever knew they had arrived. Neither knew that this moment behind the administrative building was both beginning and ending, promise and farewell wrapped into one. In week 9, Michiko, fully recovered and stronger than she had been in years, organized an impromptu tea ceremony in the barracks. She had stolen supplies from the kitchen with Chef Raymond's knowing permission. The tea was makeshift, brewed in a borrowed pot. The cups were clean tin cans. But the ritual was real, the intention pure. All 47 women sat in a circle on the barracks floor. Michiko poured tea for each of them with careful ceremony, her movements practiced and precise despite the crude materials. When everyone had been served, she spoke. "I am 42 years old. My son died at Iwo Jima. My husband died in China. I came here expecting to die too." Her voice was steady without self-pity. "Instead, American doctor carried me like I was his own mother. Korean girl." She looked at Harumi, who met her eyes for the first time with something like recognition. "Held my hand when I was scared. Enemy became human." She paused, sipped her tea. "When we go home, we carry truth they don't want to hear. That the enemy was kind, that we were wrong. That makes us traitors or witnesses. You choose which." The silence that followed was profound. Each woman sat with her own choice, knowing that the decision would shape the rest of her life. On day 55, Betty brought a camera to work. It was against regulations, but she did it anyway. She gathered the Japanese women and took a group photograph of all 47 of them standing outside the barracks. Then she took individual photos capturing moments that would become talismans against forgetting. Sakura stood next to Morrison, appropriate distance, maintained, both of them looking at the camera, with expressions that tried to be professional, but could not quite hide the truth beneath. Reiko stood beside Carter outside the hospital. He looked stern as always, but his hand rested on her shoulder in a gesture that spoke of respect and something like paternal pride. Chef Raymond posed with his kitchen crew, including Keiko, who now smiled easily in his presence. After the photos were developed, Betty distributed them with careful inscriptions on the back. Dr. Carter wrote on Reiko's photo in his precise handwriting, "Reiko Hayashi, best nurse I ever trained." Morrison's inscription was shorter, more personal. "Never forget you're stronger than you know, JM." These photographs would be carried across an ocean, would survive. Decades would become evidence of an impossible truth. The ship that would take them back to Japan departed from California on October 25, 1945. The women retraced the journey they had made months earlier, but they were different travelers now. They had left Japan as prisoners convinced they were sailing toward death. They left America as women who no longer understood certainty, who carried questions instead of answers, who had been changed by kindness more profoundly than they ever could have been by cruelty. The voyage took 3 weeks. The women stayed together, a unit bound by shared experience that no one outside their group could fully understand. They talked endlessly about what they would find, what they would say, how they would explain the inexplicable. When the Japanese coast finally appeared on the horizon, many women began to cry. Home. After everything, they were going home. But home was no longer what they had left behind. The ship docked at Yokohama on November 15, 1945. The women stood at the railing staring at what remained of Japan. The dock was half destroyed and its pilings blackened and broken. The city beyond was a landscape of devastation. Buildings reduced to skeletal frames, streets lined with rubble. The smell of ash still hung in the air months after the firebombing had stopped. Survivors moved through the ruins like ghosts, emaciated figures in rags, their faces hollow with hunger and loss, their eyes empty of everything except the will to survive one more day. The contrast with Fort McClellan's abundance hit the women like a physical blow. Sakura stepped off the ship wearing relatively new clothes, American-issued cotton that was clean and whole. She carried a bag containing soap, a toothbrush, several chocolate bars saved from the canteen, clean underwear, her notebook, and the photograph of Morrison. She saw a Japanese woman, perhaps 40 years old, sitting against a broken wall. The woman's ribs were visible through her torn clothing. She held out a hand, begging silently. Sakura could not make eye contact. The guilt was too immense. "We lived better as prisoners than they did as free people," Reiko whispered beside her. It was the truth none of them wanted to speak, but all of them felt. The women were processed through a repatriation center, given small amounts of money, and released to find their own way home. Many had no homes to return to. Addresses no longer existed. Entire neighborhoods had been erased. Families had scattered or died. It took Sakura 3 days to find her mother. 3 days of walking through devastated Tokyo, of asking at refugee centers, of following fragments of information from people who remembered the Tanaka family. She finally found her mother, Yuki Tanaka, in a refugee camp on the outskirts of what had once been their neighborhood. The camp was a sea of makeshift shelters, thousands of people living in structures made from sheet metal and salvaged wood. The smell of too many bodies in too small a space. The sound of coughing and crying, and the low murmur of people who had nothing left but still had to keep living. Sakura found her mother near the entrance to the camp, trying to trade a piece of cloth for a handful of rice. Yuki Tanaka had aged 20 years in the months since Sakura had last seen her. Her hair had gone completely white. Her body was skeletal, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that had once been solid. Yuki looked up, saw her daughter. Her eyes widened in disbelief. Then she fainted. Sakura's father, Takeshi, emerged from their shelter when he heard the commotion. He was 52, but looked 70. He walked with a cane, his body bent from illness and malnutrition. When he saw Sakura, he dropped the cane, ran to her on legs that barely supported him, fell to his knees. All three of them held each other on the dirt ground of the refugee camp, sobbing, unable to speak, unable to process the miracle and tragedy of reunion. That night in the cramped shelter that was now her family's home, Sakura tried to explain where she had been. "They told us you were killed," her mother said, her voice thin and fragile. "Military said all nurses and clerks died when Americans came. We held a ceremony for you." Your father cried. "I was prisoner. In America," Sakura said carefully. Her father's face, which had been soft with joy at her return, hardened. "Americans tortured you." "No, father, they fed us, gave us medicine, clean beds." Takeshi stood up abruptly, his movements stiff with anger and something that might have been shame. "That's impossible. Americans are barbarians. We were told, everything we were told was lies, father. They treated us better than our own government ever did." Takeshi walked out of the shelter. He would not speak to Sakura for 3 days. When he finally did, his words were cold, distant, filled with a disappointment that cut deeper than any anger. "You have become one of them in your heart. My daughter died in the Philippines. I don't know who you are. Across Japan, similar scenes played out as the women returned to their families and tried to explain the unexplainable. Reiko returned to Osaka to find her family's hospital destroyed, reduced to rubble and twisted metal. But her mother and brother had survived living in the hospital's basement with a dozen other families. The basement had become a makeshift clinic treating patients with almost no supplies, no medicines, no equipment. Reiko looked at the conditions, at the suffering, at the desperate need, and felt something click into place. She began working immediately using the skills Dr. Carter had refined, implementing the techniques she had learned at Fort McClellan. She treated 50 patients a day with minimal supplies, working from dawn until long after dark. 3 months after her return, she wrote a letter to Dr. Carter. It took her days to compose in her careful English. "You taught me medicine transcends nationality. I am trying to remember this truth even when it is difficult, even when supplies run out, even when I am so tired I can barely stand. Thank you for showing me what it means to be a real nurse. I will carry this lesson until I die." The letter reached Dr. Carter in Alabama 6 weeks later. He read it 3 times, then folded it carefully and placed it in his desk drawer where it would remain for the rest of his life. Michiko returned to Kyoto to find her teaching college reduced to a pile of rubble. She moved in with her sister's family, 8 people crammed into 2 rooms. One night, going through boxes of salvaged belongings, she found a bundle of letters. Her son's letters written during the war that she had never been able to bring herself to read. She read them all in one sitting by candlelight while the rest of the family slept. Her son had written about doubting the war, about hating the killing, about believing it was all meaningless. He had died convinced the war was wrong, but unable to escape it. Michiko wept silently, holding the letters to her chest. Her son had known. He had seen the truth before she had, and it had cost him everything. She made a decision that night. She would teach again, somehow, somewhere, and she would tell the truth about the war, about propaganda, about the cost of believing lies. It became her life's mission. Keiko's return was perhaps the most difficult. She went back to Tokyo, to the building where the propaganda office had been. It was ash now, nothing but a foundation and twisted metal. She stood in the ruins thinking about the words she had written, the speeches she had crafted, the lies she had spread with such conviction. Her former colleagues, those who had survived, found her. They blamed her for the defeat. "Your words weren't strong enough," they shouted at her. "You didn't make them believe hard enough." Keiko looked at them with her damaged voice and newly clear eyes. "No, my words were too strong. I lied to you. I lied to myself. And those lies helped kill millions." They called her traitor, collaborator. She was ostracized, threatened, forced to move constantly to stay ahead of those who wanted to silence her permanently. But Keiko had learned something in Alabama. She had learned that the truth, no matter how painful, was worth more than comfortable lies. In 1947, she wrote a confession article titled, "I Lied for Empire." A small magazine published it. She received death threats. She kept writing. Harumi's story was perhaps the most tragic. As a Korean woman who had been forced into sexual slavery by the Japanese military, she had no family to return to, no safe place in either Korea or Japan. She lived in the Korean district of Tokyo among other displaced and rejected women. She found work in a textile factory, lived in a single room, spoke to almost no one. But she survived. Day by day, year by year, she survived. And in 1953, she began working with an organization that helped other women who had been through similar trauma. She never spoke about her own experiences, but she listened to others, held their hands, let them know they were not alone. It was the only redemption she could find. The years passed. The women built lives in the ruins of their country. Some married, some had children, some remained alone. But all of them carried the weight of what they had experienced, the knowledge that could not be shared, the truth that few wanted to hear. Sakura became a translator for the American occupation forces, a choice that scandalized her remaining family and neighbors. In 1948, she opened a small English school teaching the enemy's language to young Japanese who wanted to build a new Japan. She never married. When asked why, she would say she was too busy with her work. The truth was more complicated. She was waiting for letters that never came. Morrison had written 3 letters in 1946 and 47. Her father intercepted them all, burned them without telling her. Sakura assumed Morrison had forgotten her, had moved on with his life. She tried to do the same. Her mother told her the truth only on her deathbed in 1950. Your father burned the Americans' letters, 3 of them. I am sorry, I should have told you. By then it was too late to respond. Too much time had passed. Too much had changed. In 1952, Reiko was invited to attend an American medical conference in San Francisco. It was controversial, a Japanese nurse attending an American event only 7 years after the war's end. But her hospital director, who knew her work and valued her skills, pushed for her to go. She went. And on the third day of the conference, she saw Dr. William Carter in the hallway. He was 61, retired from active military service, working as a consultant. He had aged his hair completely white, his movements slower than she remembered. But his eyes, when he saw her, lit up with recognition and something that might have been joy. They talked for 3 hours over coffee. He asked about her work. She told him about the clinic, about the patients she treated with minimal supplies, about implementing the techniques he had taught her. He listened with the same intense focus he had brought to medicine, asking questions, offering suggestions, treating her like the colleague she had become. At the end of their conversation, Reiko gave him a gift she had brought from Japan, a tea set simple but elegant, wrapped in blue cloth. "You saved more than our lives," she said in English that had improved dramatically over the years. "You saved our humanity. Thank you." Carter accepted the gift with hands that shook slightly. "You became what I saw in you, better than me." They never saw each other again. But they corresponded by letter for the next 10 years until Carter's death in 1962. If you've experienced similar moral complexity in war or military service, if you've seen humanity persist in impossible circumstances, your story matters. Please share your experiences in the comments below. These memories are the bridge between past and present. 1985, 40 years after the war's end. A reunion was organized in Osaka, bringing together survivors of the Fort McClellan internment. Of the original 47 women, 35 had died. Of the 12 survivors, 8 were able to attend. They ranged in age from 63 to 82. They met in a private room at a traditional restaurant, these elderly women who shared something that no one else could fully understand. Some arrived in wheelchairs, some walked with canes. All of them wept when they saw each other. Sakura was 63, a widow with 2 grown children. She had told them about Fort McClellan, but they had never fully understood. To them, it was just another war story, interesting, but not meaningful. Reiko was 66, retired from nursing, living alone in a small apartment in Tokyo. Her life had been her work. She had trained hundreds of nurses, had built a reputation as a skilled teacher and healer. She had never married, never had children. The hospital had been her family. Keiko was 75, frail but fierce, her damaged voice still carrying the rasp of the rope. She had become a peace activist, speaking at schools and universities about the dangers of propaganda. She had written 3 books. Critics still called her traitor. Students called her hero. She wore both labels with equal acceptance. Harumi was 59. She had never spoken about her time as a comfort woman, not even to the other Fort McClellan survivors. But she had helped hundreds of other women find their voices, find healing, find the strength to keep living. She sat quietly at the reunion, watching and listening, as she always had. The women talked for hours, sharing stories of the decades since they had last been together. Children and grandchildren, careers and disappointments, losses and small victories. The texture of lives lived in the shadow of one transformative experience. Then the organizer, one of the younger women who had helped arrange the reunion, stood up with an announcement. "We have something special, a surprise." She wheeled in a television and VCR, set it up and pressed play. The screen flickered to life, and there, recorded on video just weeks earlier, was Dr. William Carter. He was 94 years old, sitting in a chair in what appeared to be a nursing home. His face was deeply lined, his hands trembled slightly, but his eyes were still sharp, still intelligent. "Ladies," he said, his voice thin but clear, "I'm too old to travel. The doctors won't let me get on a plane. But I wanted you to know." He paused, emotion making his voice shake. "That night I carried Machiko. I didn't think about politics, didn't think about enemies. Just saw a dying woman who needed help. That's all. Just a person who needed help." He wiped his eyes with a handkerchief. "You taught me something too. You taught me that hatred is learned, but so is love. That healing has no nationality. That we're all just people trying to survive in a world that makes survival too hard." Another pause. He was crying now, not trying to hide it. Reiko, wherever you are, you were my finest student. You became everything I hoped you would be. To all of you, thank you for surviving. Thank you for carrying the truth. The war is over. We can be human again. The screen went dark. In the restaurant's private room, all 8 women were crying. They held hands in a circle, these elderly survivors of an impossible time, connected by something that transcended nationality and language, and all the years that had passed. Keiko spoke first, her raspy voice carrying absolute conviction. He gave me my life twice. Once with his hands, when he saved me from the rope. Once with his heart, when he showed me there was something worth living for. Sakura stood shaking. She had kept a secret for 40 years. Now in this room, with the only people who might understand, she finally spoke it aloud. There was an American guard, James Morrison. We had feelings for each other. Nothing happened, nothing improper, but the feelings were real. She pulled out the photograph Betty had taken, carefully preserved for 4 decades. Morrison and Sakura standing at appropriate distance, both trying to look professional, both failing to hide the truth. He wrote me letters. My father burned them. I didn't know until my mother told me before she died. I searched for him in the 70s, found his sister in California. Her voice broke. He died in 1972. Heart attack. He never married. His sister said he kept my address in his wallet until the day he died. She said he wrote in his will, "If Sakura Tanaka ever asks about me, tell her I never forgot." The room erupted in sobs. 8 elderly women weeping for a love that could never be, for a man who waited 40 years for a letter that never came because it had been burned by a father who could not accept that enemies could be human. Finally, Machiko stood. She was 82, the oldest survivor present. She had been the one carried by Dr. Carter, the one whose near death had changed everything. She walked to the center of the circle, moving slowly but steadily, and spoke with the clarity of someone who has spent 40 years thinking about a single moment. 40 years ago, an American doctor carried me. That moment changed everything, not just for us, for everyone who witnessed it. She looked at each woman in turn. We expected cruelty, got kindness. We expected hatred, got indifference, which was better. We expected death, got life. Her voice grew stronger. Japan taught us to die with honor. America taught us to live with dignity. And I have spent 40 years telling anyone who will listen, the enemy was human. That scared me more than any torture could. Because if the enemy is human, then so were we. And that means the war was just humans killing humans. No glory, no righteousness, just waste. The silence that followed was profound. These women who had spent decades trying to articulate what they had experienced finally heard it spoken with perfect clarity. The narrator's voice, speaking from the present day, returned to complete the story. That night in 1945, when Sergeant Morrison cut Sakura down from her suicide attempt, he didn't just save a life. He saved a witness. 47 witnesses. Women who would spend the next 40 years carrying an uncomfortable truth. That the enemy can be kind. That propaganda can lie. That humanity can exist even between people trained to kill each other. The screen shows the group photograph from 1945. 47 young Japanese women standing with American staff outside the Fort McClellan barracks. Betty Chen, James Morrison, Dr. William Carter, Chef Raymond Williams. Everyone smiling, capturing an impossible moment that should not have existed but did. Morrison's inscription is visible on the back, "Never forget you're stronger than you know." They never forgot. Not the kindness, not the chocolate, not the doctor who carried their friend, not the guard who saved a life when he could have let her die, not the enemy who became human. And in remembering, they became witnesses to the most dangerous truth of all, that in war, the hardest thing to face isn't your enemy's cruelty, it's their mercy. Because cruelty confirms what you were taught. Mercy destroys it. Mercy forces you to see the enemy as human. And once you see that, you can never unsee it. These 47 women carried that truth for the rest of their lives. Some were rejected by their families. Some were called traitors. Some were ostracized by communities that wanted simple stories of good and evil, not complicated truths about humanity and kindness. But they never stopped telling their story. They never stopped witnessing. Because they understood something that most people never learn, that the most powerful weapon is not violence, It's mercy. It's the hot water and clean beds, and the moment when an enemy doctor carries a dying woman like she matters. That destroys certainty more completely than any bomb ever could. These women are gone now. The last survivor died in 2003, but their photographs remain. Their letters remain. Their truth remains. And 40 years after the war ended, Keiko Matsuda, the woman who had written propaganda about American brutality, the woman who had tried to kill herself rather than accept American kindness, said something that might be the most important lesson of World War II that nobody teaches. The Americans didn't just defeat us with bombs, they defeated us with hot water, clean beds, and a doctor who thought a dying enemy deserved to be carried. That might be more important than any battle ever won. That is the story of 47 Japanese women who went to Fort McClellan, Alabama as enemies and left as witnesses, who learned that propaganda lies, that governments manipulate, that the truth is always more complicated than anyone wants to admit, that enemies can show mercy, and that mercy can be more devastating than any cruelty. If this story moved you, please share it. These histories deserve to be remembered. These truths need to be told. Because somewhere right now, someone is being taught to hate an enemy they've never met. Someone is being told lies about people they don't know. Someone is building their identity on the certainty that they are right and others are wrong. And the 47 women of Fort McClellan, if they could speak to us now, would say, question that certainty. Seek the truth. Remember that enemies are human. And never forget that kindness can be the most powerful weapon of all. Thank you for listening. Please share your own family's war stories in the comments below. These memories are fading. We must preserve them while we still can.